Get comfortable and let your breathing slow. There's nothing left to do tonight but rest. With the lights low, we'll drift through the old myth of Prometheus, who brought fire down to the world. If these help you sleep, subscribe. I post a new one every night. Iapetus, Clymene, and then their 4 sons, named in the oldest order. The tradition preserved them: Atlas, Meneucus, Prometheus, Epimetheus. Those names come down from Hesiod's theogony, set into the genealogical architecture of the Greek cosmos, the way stones are set into a wall, each one placed, each one load-bearing, each one exactly where it was put, and not somewhere else. The family is announced before the story begins. That is how these things were told. The theogony is among the oldest literary texts in the Greek tradition, composed by the poet Hesiod sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, and its subject is precisely this: the full genealogy of the divine world, from the first undifferentiated beginnings, through every generation of gods and titans and monsters, down to the point where the cosmos settles into the arrangement it will hold from then onward. It is, in the most literal sense, the family tree of the Greek universe, and Prometheus sits inside it, not as a late addition or a borrowed figure, but as a member of one of its oldest and most central lineages, the children of Iapetus, who was himself the son of Uranus and Gaia, sky and earth, making Prometheus the grandson of the 2 oldest parents the tradition imagines. Iapetus himself is not a figure who moves through many stories. He is, more than anything, a position in the genealogy, a Titan father whose significance is largely defined by the children he produced. In Hesiod's account, he takes Clymene as his partner, an Oceanid, one of the 3,000 daughters of the Titans Oceanus, and Tethys, who personified the springs and rivers and streams of the world. Clymene's name carries the sense of famous or renowned, and she is described in the tradition as gentle, as befitting a figure associated with water and its particular kind of quiet motion. Together they produce 4 sons, and those 4 sons are assigned in the way the mythological tradition assigns things, to 4 distinct and almost perfectly defined roles in the story the cosmos is trying to tell. Atlas is the oldest, and Atlas will bear the sky on his shoulders. That burden, assigned to him after the war that ends the Titan's dominion, is among the most durable images in the entire Greek tradition. A Titan standing at the far western edge of the world, arms raised, holding the celestial vault away from the earth so that the 2 do not collapse back into each other. The weight he carries is not metaphorical. In the tradition as Hesiod understood it, the sky above and the earth below required something between them, and Atlas became that something. Meneucus is the brother whose name carries a suggestion of doomed might or ruinous strength, and the tradition is clear that he was destroyed early. Hesiod, in the Theogony, records that Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt during the Titanomachy and sent him down into Tartarus, and there Meneucus more or less remains, a figure significant, mainly in contrast to his brothers, whose stories extend further and deeper into the tradition's memory. Epimetheus, the youngest of the 4, carries a name that means something quite precise: afterthought. The prefix epii conveys the sense of behind or after, and metis means thought, counsel, wisdom of a practical and considered kind. Epimetheus is, in name and in function, the one who understands only after it is too late, the one whose comprehension always arrives a step behind the event it needed to precede. He is not foolish exactly, but he acts without forethought, and the tradition assigns him consequences accordingly. His role is to serve as the deliberate counterpart to the brother whose name faces the opposite direction, the one who thinks before, where Epimetheus thinks after. That brother is Prometheus. The name Prometheus contains the same root, metis, that same word, meaning thought, counsel, practical wisdom, the kind of knowing that looks at a situation and perceives what it requires. But where Epimetheus has epii, Prometheus has before. Prometheus is the one who thinks ahead. His name is not merely a descriptor attached to him by later interpreters. It is the character's defining trait, encoded in the word itself, so that every time his name is spoken, the essential quality of the figure is already present within it, already announced, already placed in the structure of the name, the way a seed is placed inside a pod. The meaning does not need to be explained. It is already there. You hear it in the word. Ancient Greek names often worked this way. They were not decorative. They were functional, carrying within them something essential about the thing named, whether a place or a person or a god. The names of the Titans, especially, tend to be this kind of name. Atlas bearing his burden in his title, Themis carrying law and right order in hers, Mnemosyne containing memory, Hyperion holding the sense of going above or over. The Greek theological tradition had a habit of naming what it meant, and what it meant tended to be precise. Prometheus means forethought. He is, in the deepest structural sense, the figure who acts from prior understanding, who sees consequences before they arrive, who arranges the present in awareness of what the future holds. That is the characteristic which will define every significant thing he does. It is already present in the name. The tradition is telling the listener, before the story has begun in any proper sense, exactly who this figure is and how he operates. The world Prometheus was born into was not the world as the Greeks of the classical period knew it. The Titans were the generation before the Olympians, the second generation of divine beings, born of Uranus the sky and Gaia the earth, and they ruled during what Hesiod's Works and Days describes as the Golden Age, the first and most abundant of the 5 ages through which humanity passed in that tradition's cosmology. The Golden Age was a time before toil. Human beings in that age lived without illness and without the wearing labor that would define later existence. They ate from what grew freely. They did not need to break the earth with plows or guard their barns against winter. The seasons gave what was needed. The world was generous in the way a world not yet organized around scarcity could be generous, which is to say simply and without condition. The Titans presided over that age. They were, in Hesiod's cosmogony, the deities of a cosmos not yet divided into the harder, more specifically governed arrangement that the Olympian order would eventually establish. The Titans were large and largely undifferentiated, vast, powerful, related in complicated ways to the elemental forces of the world. Oceanus to the encircling waters, Hyperion to the passage of the sun and moon, Themis to the deep principles of natural and moral order. They were not Olympians, with their particular personalities and their specific domains and their complex involvements in human affairs. They were older, vaster, less individuated, more like forces given form than persons given stories. The world they ruled was arranged, in Greek cosmological thinking, as a vertical architecture of considerable precision. At the top, Olympus, or rather above Olympus, the upper air, the aether, the pure and luminous space where nothing mortal could breathe or stand. Then the mountain itself, where the Olympian gods would eventually reside. Then the middle realm, the earth as humans inhabit it, the broad and varied world of plains and seas, and mountains and cities. Then beneath the earth, the underworld in its levels and compartments, its rivers and its judges, and its particular populations. And at the very bottom, the deepest and most complete bottom, Tartarus, a pit so far below the surface of the earth that, as Hesiod described it, an anvil dropped from the heavens would fall 9 days before reaching the earth, and then another 9 days before reaching Tartarus, a depth that is not merely geographic but cosmological, a place designed to be unreachable, to serve as the most complete possible form of removal from the world above. Iapetus stands somewhere within this architecture as a titan of the middle and far distances, associated with the west, with mortality, with the pillar that the tradition imagined holding earth and heaven apart, at one of the 4 corners of the world. His sons are distributed across the architecture in ways that reflect their functions. Atlas at the western edge, holding the sky, Menuetius driven down to Tartarus by Zeus's thunderbolt, Epimetheus moving through the middle world and its consequences, and Prometheus occupying, as he always does, the space between things, the threshold positions, the places where one order meets another. The generation of Titans ruled until the war changed everything. The Titanomachy is the name the tradition gives to the conflict between the Titans and the Olympians, a 10-year war fought on a scale that shook the cosmos, in which the new generation of gods under Zeus ultimately overcame the ruling order and established the arrangement that would define the Greek divine world from that point onward. Hesiod describes the battle in the Theogony with a vividness that is unusual in his generally genealogical text. The mountains trembling, the deep sea boiling, the earth groaning, the sky ringing with the noise of it, and the outcome was the imprisonment of most of the Titans in Tartarus, bound there, guarded by the 100-handed ones who had been liberated from that same pit to serve as Zeus's allies. Most of the Titans, not all. Prometheus is documented in the ancient sources as an exception. The tradition records that he sided with Zeus and the Olympians during the Titanomachy, that a Titan, born of Iapetus and Clymene, and possessing the full lineage and standing of the old divine order, fought against the Titans when the war came. He was not imprisoned in Tartarus with his kin. He was not struck down as his brother Menuetius was struck down. He stood with the winning side, and when the war was over and the Olympian order was established, and Zeus took his place as the sovereign of the reorganized cosmos, Prometheus was among those who had helped make that outcome possible. The tradition does not extensively explain why. It records the fact Prometheus, a Titan, aided Zeus, and it notes, as a trait entirely consistent with his name, that his forethought may have been involved. A figure who perceives the future before it arrives would be well positioned to understand which side of a war to join, but the tradition does not assign specific reasons to him, and a careful account of the mythological record does not invent them. What is recorded is the fact Prometheus aided Zeus. What is not recorded is the interiority behind it. What that alignment produced was a relationship between Prometheus and the Olympian order that was unlike any other Titan's relationship with the new power. The other Titans who survived the Titanomachy without destruction, Atlas, condemned to hold the sky, existed in a relationship of defeat and compulsion. But Prometheus had been an ally. He had done something that benefited Zeus directly and materially, had contributed to the outcome that placed Zeus at the summit of the cosmos. The relationship between them began, therefore, not in defeat, but in something resembling partnership, or at least shared interest. A Titan stood at the side of the god who had overthrown the Titans. That is a position that has no exact parallel in the tradition, and the tension inside it, the strangeness of it, the inherent instability of an alliance between the new order and one of the old, is something the tradition will not entirely let rest. But for now, in the earliest period that follows the Titanomachy, that tension is not yet visible. The cosmos has been organized. The Olympians hold their positions. Tartarus holds most of the Titans in the darkness at the bottom of everything. And Prometheus, who knows how to think ahead, who carries that knowledge in his very name, stands somewhere in the rearranged world as a figure who is neither fully of the Olympian order nor fully opposed to it. A Titan who helped Zeus, a being whose name means forethought, standing in the new world that his foresight helped create. That is the position the tradition places him in at the beginning, before the theft, before the punishment, before any of the great events of his story begin to accumulate their weight. This is where Prometheus stands, in the in-between space, as he almost always does, related by blood to the old order, aligned by action with the new one, carrying in his name the quality that will define everything he does and everything that is done to him in return. The Greek cosmos, as Hesiod mapped it, was not a vague or imprecise arrangement. It had dimensions, it had named regions, it had the vertical axis from Olympus to Tartarus, along which the gods and the dead and the imprisoned moved, and it had the horizontal expanse of the earth, mapped from the center outward to the edges where the oceanate waters encircled everything. Within that map, each being had a position that was both geographical and cosmological, a location that reflected what that being was in the order of things, not merely where they happened to be standing. Iapetus and his family occupied the western reaches of that map, associated with the Pillar of the West and the distances beyond the known world. The far west, in the Greek geographical imagination, was the direction of endings, of the sun going down, of the edge of the inhabited world, of the places where extraordinary things could be found, precisely because they were beyond the ordinary reach of the middle world. The Hesperides and their golden apples were in the far west. Atlas was in the far west. The western margins were where the tradition placed things that were significant in ways that exceeded the normal scale of things, and the sons of Iapetus fit that placement with the easy fit of figures whose significance had always operated at the edge of what could be contained within ordinary categories. Prometheus, however, does not stay at the edge. The tradition does not assign him to the western extremities as it assigns Atlas there. He moves, he operates in the middle world, in the space where gods and mortals interact, in the places where the categories of divine and human are being negotiated and defined. He is a Titan with the mobility of a god who has business everywhere. His name means forethought, and forethought is not a quality that stays at the edges. It moves toward consequence, toward the place where something is about to happen, toward the moment where seeing clearly in advance could change what the future holds. The tradition as Hesiod organized it gives the Greek cosmos a quality that might be described as densely inhabited. Every stream had its naiad, every sea its nereid, every grove its nymphs, every wind its named divine figure, every abstract principle of natural or moral order, its Titan or Olympian or minor deity. The world was not empty. It was full, every part of it, with beings who had existed since before the human world had taken its present form, who had been there when the mountains were shaped, and the rivers found their beds, and the sea was given its particular saltness and depth. A human being moving through that world was moving through a world that was already very old and very completely peopled long before any human step touched the ground. Into that fullness, that dense and ancient cosmic population, Hesiod places Prometheus with the care of a poet who understands that where a figure stands in the genealogy determines everything about what that figure means. He is not an Olympian. He is not a mortal. He has been a Titan with a Titan's genealogy, and a Titan's age, and a Titan's relationship to the deep structure of the cosmos. But he is also a Titan who chose the winning side in the war that divided the old order from the new. He is connected to both. He belongs entirely to neither. And in that between space, in that position that the tradition has prepared for him with such structural care, his name already announces what he does. He thinks ahead. He is the one who sees. The four brothers, Atlas, Menoetius, Prometheus, Epimetheus, form a kind of complete picture of ways of existing in the world that the tradition has set in deliberate opposition. Atlas bears weight without end. Menoetius overcomes through destructive strength and is destroyed for it. Epimetheus acts and understands afterward. Prometheus perceives before. Between the four of them, the tradition seems to arrange something like a taxonomy of possible Titan qualities, and in doing so, places Prometheus at the particular end of the spectrum that is most interesting and most active and most consequential, the quality of mind that looks forward, that anticipates, that already knows the shape of what is coming. That quality will matter. The tradition will make it matter in ways that are consequential for the entire human world, as the Greeks understood it. But in this early period, in this moment before the events that will define his story begin to unfold, Prometheus is simply a member of an old family, occupying a particular position in a very thoroughly mapped cosmos. The son of Iapetus, the brother of Atlas and Menoetius, and Epimetheus, a Titan who stood on the side of Zeus when the sides were still being chosen and the outcome was not yet settled. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century, was drawing on traditions far older than his text. The theogony is the literary crystallization of cosmogonical thinking that had been circulating in the Greek world for generations before him, and in organizing it into the form that survived. He was also making choices about sequence, about genealogy, about which relationships were primary and which were secondary, about which figures deserved extensive treatment and which were named and set aside. That he includes Prometheus prominently and carefully, with the full genealogical accounting of his parentage and his siblings and his brother's name's precise meaning, signals that the tradition Hesiod was drawing on already regarded this figure as significant enough to be placed with care. The name Epimetheus, afterthought, placed in direct relation to Prometheus, forethought, creates a structure that is too precise to be accidental. The tradition built this pairing deliberately. Two brothers whose names face opposite directions in time, who together contain between them the full range of one of the most fundamental human experiences, the experience of understanding either before or after the moment when understanding could make a difference. Epimetheus understands after. He takes Pandora as his wife despite his brother's explicit warning, and the consequences that follow from that acceptance are among the most significant in the tradition's account of the human condition. He is the model of the too late recognition, the figure who receives counsel from someone wiser and proceeds anyway, and discovers afterward in the changed world what the counsel was protecting him from. Prometheus understands before. That is his gift, his characteristic, the thing encoded in his name. In the arrangement of the Greek cosmos, where names are functional and positions are structural, and every figure has a role that reflects their nature, Prometheus is the one who already knows. The world he inhabits in this earliest period, before the events that will make his name one of the most discussed in the entire Greek tradition, is the world Hesiod describes in its ordered, arranged, post-Titanomachy form. Zeus has taken his position, the Olympians are established, the Titans who opposed the new order are in Tartarus. And among those who are not in Tartarus, there is a Titan who helped Zeus win, who carries a name meaning he sees what is coming, who stands in the new world as a member of both the old generation and the circle of those the new power has reason to regard as allies. The strangeness of that position, a Titan among the Olympians' allies, a being of the old order standing in the new, is something the tradition seems to find worth preserving, not because it will be resolved, but because it is genuinely interesting. The mythological tradition does not always require resolution. Sometimes it requires the careful description of a condition, a placement, a name, so that when the events that follow begin to occur, the listener understands not just what happens, but who the figure is to whom it happens. The structure of the story has been preparing since before the story properly began. Iapetus and Clymene, in the western reaches of the Greek cosmos, produced 4 sons. The sons were distributed across the arrangement of the world in ways that reflected their natures. Atlas to his burden at the edge of things, Meneuidius to his early and violent erasure, Epimetheus to his particular quality of always too late comprehension, and Prometheus to the between space, to the threshold position, to the role of the one who sees ahead. The Titanomacy came and altered the world, and when it was over, most of what had been was imprisoned at the bottom of the cosmos. Atlas bore the sky at the western edge. Meneuidius won. Epimetheus moved through the new world with his characteristic quality of not quite sufficient foresight, waiting for the consequences that his name had always promised him. And Prometheus stood beside Zeus, a Titan who had helped overthrow the Titans, in a position that the tradition describes without fully explaining, that it preserves without fully resolving, that it records with the calm and specific interest of a tradition that understands the value of leaving the genuinely interesting things exactly as they are. He had thought ahead. He had seen which side would win. He had placed himself, with the full precision of a figure whose name is forethought itself, in the position that allowed him to survive the war and emerge on the side of the new order, whether that was wisdom or calculation, or simply the inevitable expression of a nature that the tradition had already encoded in the name it gave him before the story began. That question the tradition does not answer. It simply states the fact: Prometheus aided Zeus. He was there when the new order was established. He was part of what made it possible. A Titan who helped overthrow the Titans, a figure with the name of foresight, standing in the world that his foresight had in some sense created. The strangeness of that sits in the oldest records of the tradition, the way it always has, quietly, precisely, without resolution, as interesting as it was the first time it was written down. Ferula communis grows tall. Along the rocky hillsides of the Mediterranean coast, on the limestone slopes above the sea, it rises to the height of a standing person, sometimes taller, its pale jointed stalk climbing in sections, one above the next, each joint a slight swelling before the stalk continues upward. The exterior of the plant is smooth. It is the color of old ivory or dry bone, and in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, it carries almost no moisture. The outer surface does not invite attention. It looks, at a distance, like something already used up, something the season has finished with. The stalk is what the plant is. Really, the leaves spread outward from the upper joints in fine feathery fronds, yellow-green and aromatic, and the plant may flower in its early years with flat-topped clusters of small yellow blooms, but the stalk persists after the flowers are gone. It persists after the leaves have drawn back. In the dryness of late summer, the Ferula communis stalk stands alone on the hillside, upright, pale, hollow at the core, and it is the hollow that matters here. Inside the stalk, beneath the smooth exterior that gives nothing away, the pith of the plant has dried to a fine, soft, whitish fiber. The interior of each section is a small chamber of that material, lightweight, dry, porous, and a thing placed inside it carefully, a living ember pressed into the pith and allowed to breathe, will smolder, not burn, not glow visibly, simply persist, the way a thought persists in a mind before it is spoken, present and alive, and giving no outward sign of what it is. This is the plant. This is what it looks like before anything is placed inside it. A tall stalk on a Mediterranean hillside, pale and jointed, and carrying inside it nothing more dramatic than a column of dried plant matter, and the warmth of the afternoon sun moving across its exterior without finding anything there that needed to be watched or feared or even noticed. The ember comes later, the fire comes later. Before any of that, there is only the plant standing where it always stood in its ordinary landscape, doing what the season asked of it. In Hesiod's Works and Days, at lines 52 and 53, Prometheus is described as having stolen fire that travels far inside a hollow fennel stalk. The precision of the image is worth attending to. Hesiod does not say Prometheus carried fire in his hands. He does not say Prometheus wrapped it in cloth or sealed it in clay. The specific plant is specified. The specific physical property of the plant is what makes the act possible, and the phrase that Hesiod uses, fire that travels far, gives the flame a quality it would not otherwise have. Fire ordinarily does not travel. Fire is fixed to its source. Fire requires a fuel it can consume, and when the fuel is gone, the fire is gone with it. A flame taken from a hearth and carried across an open hillside in cupped hands would be extinguished in moments, snuffed by the wind, or starved of what it needed. Fire belongs where it is, that is, in the ordinary understanding of the ancient world, simply the nature of fire. The fennel stalk changes this. The stalk creates the condition under which fire becomes something else, something with the capacity to move across distance without being seen, without being known, without the wind finding it. The ember inside the pith of the stalk is separated from the open air by the stalk's own walls, but it is not sealed away from the air entirely. The pith breathes. The ember receives just enough oxygen through the plant's own cellular structure to stay alive, feeding slowly on the surrounding fiber, inching forward through the material in a line of ash and heat that leaves no smoke worth noticing and no glow visible from the outside. The exterior of the stalk remains what it was, pale, dry, unremarkable, while inside it a line of heat moves patiently from one end toward the other, or simply waits, sustained by the pith, ready to be opened when the moment comes. Fire that travels far, or the phrase sits in the ancient text with a kind of quiet exactness. What Prometheus carried was not a torch visible from a distance, held aloft and obvious in the way of ceremony. What he carried was something enclosed, something patient, something that required, from the outside, no particular explanation, and attracted from the outside no particular notice. A tall man walking with a tall stalk is simply a tall man with a tall plant, and the Greeks of the ancient world knew the Ferula communis well. It was common on the hillsides around them, unremarkable to the eye, used in everyday life for any number of practical purposes. The plant itself was not significant. The hollow was not visible. Nothing on the surface of the transaction gave away what was inside it. The fire that Prometheus took had a source. In the Greek tradition, as Hesiod tells it, fire in its original and proper form belonged to the gods, and specifically, in the account of the theft in its context, fire had been Zeus's to give or withhold. The Theogony presents the sequence clearly enough. What had happened before the theft? The division of the sacrificial ox at a gathering called Mecone, where Prometheus arranged the portions in a way that disadvantaged Zeus, had angered the god of gods, and the anger had been expressed in a particular way. Zeus had hidden fire from mortal men. Lines 47 through 52 of the Works and Days describe the act explicitly, framing it as a deliberate withdrawal. Zeus acting in anger at heart, concealing the means by which human beings might sustain themselves, removing from the human world something that had been, until that moment, available to it. The fire that Prometheus stole was fire that had already been taken away. He was recovering something that had been removed. Whether the fire came from Olympus directly or from some intermediate divine source, the tradition is consistent in placing it within the divine order, belonging to the gods, under the authority of Zeus, unavailable to human beings by deliberate divine choice. Mount Olympus in the ancient Greek imagination was not simply a tall mountain with cold upper slopes. It was the residence of the divine order in its organized Olympian form, the place where the 12 great gods maintained their permanent dwellings, where they gathered to deliberate, where the atmosphere was not ordinary mountain air, but something closer to what the Greeks called aether, the bright upper air that the gods breathed and mortal lungs could not sustain. The summit of Olympus did not merely disappear into cloud, as the peaks of high mountains do. It extended in the Greek cosmological imagination above the clouds into a space of permanent brightness and divine clarity, unreachable and unsuitable for anything mortal. To take fire from that place, or from the fire that belonged to it, and carry it downward through the intervening space, through the upper air and the lower atmosphere, and across the landscape of the mortal world, was to move something from the divine order into the human one. It was a crossing, not an erasure of the boundary, since the gods remained above and human beings remained below, but a passing of something across that boundary in the wrong direction against the current of divine intention. Prometheus, carrying the stalk, was carrying the crossing itself. The fennel stalk was the instrument of the transfer, and the transfer was what Zeus had specifically and deliberately prevented. Hesiod's Theogony, at lines 562 through 564, describes the theft in a compact declarative register that does not elaborate and does not explain. The act is stated: Prometheus stole fire of far-seeing Zeus, which travels far, in a hollow fennel stalk. The phrase far-seeing belongs to Zeus as a standard epithet, a quality of divine vision that extends across distances no mortal eye can reach. The phrase traveling far belongs to the fire itself, and in the juxtaposition of these two qualities, something worth noticing sits quietly in the text. The far-seeing god and the far-traveling fire face each other across the lines of the poem. Zeus sees far. The fire travels far. The god's gaze and the fire's movement share the same quality of extent, the same relationship with distance, and the fire moves in the direction the god has tried to prevent it from moving, through a vessel the god's gaze, for the moment, has not found. It is worth setting that image down carefully, without pressing it further than it goes. Hesiod is not, in these lines, elaborating a philosophical argument about divine omniscience. He is telling a story about a theft, and telling it plainly. The fire traveled far. It went where it was not supposed to go. The fennel stalk was how the fire arrived in the mortal world. What did that mean? The question is worth approaching through what the ancient Greek world actually required of fire, because the gift Prometheus carried was not abstract. It was not symbolic in the sense of representing something that human beings did not literally need. Fire in the ancient Mediterranean was the practical foundation of almost everything that distinguished settled human existence from the life of an animal foraging in the open. It was the means by which food was cooked, not merely made more pleasant to eat, but in many cases made safe, made digestible, made storable in ways that raw food could not be. A community without fire was a community without bread, without boiled grain, without the preservation of meat by smoking or by the rendering of fat. These were not luxuries. In the specific ecological and agricultural conditions of the ancient Greek world, the ability to process and preserve food through the application of heat was what the difference between survival through a winter and failing to survive that winter looked like, practically speaking. But fire in the Greek world extended considerably beyond cooking. The tradition of the Prytanean, the civic hearth, the sacred fire, maintained at the administrative and ceremonial center of a Greek polis, was one of the organizing institutions of Greek civic life. Every properly constituted Greek city had one. The flame burned continuously, tended by designated officials, and it was understood as more than a practical resource. It was the spiritual center of the community, the point of continuity around which civic identity organized itself. A colony leaving the mother city to found a new settlement carried a portion of the mother city's sacred flame with it, so that the Prytaneon of the new polis would be lit from the same source as the old. The fire connected the new city to the original city across whatever distance separated them, across the water, across the years. It was a form of inheritance, a form of continuity, a literal transference of origin from one place to another. The fire Prometheus carried, then, was the fire that eventually burned in every Prytanean across the Greek world, every civic hearth, every flame at the center of every city. The chain of transmission was mythologically simple. Prometheus brought fire from the divine source to the mortal world, and from that point, the mortal world distributed across communities, across generations, across the sea, in the form of every fire that ever burned in a Greek city. The ember inside the fennel stalk was, in this sense, the source of all of them. In Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, written in the 4th century before the Common Era, the sophist Protagoras delivers a mythological account of human origins that expands the stakes of the Prometheus story considerably. In this account, as Plato reports it at lines 320 through 322, Prometheus does not steal only fire. He steals fire alongside what Plato calls techne, the practical wisdom of the crafts, the technical capacity by which human beings make things. The two come together from the forge of Hephaestus and from the domain of Athena, the goddess of practical intelligence and skilled work. Fire and the wisdom to use it are taken as a single gift, inseparable, and what Prometheus delivers to the human world in this account is not simply heat, but the entire complex of civilizational capacity that heat makes possible. What does that complex include? The smith who shapes bronze in a fire hot enough to liquefy metal and then works the cooling form into a blade, a bowl, a fitting for a wheel. The potter who turns clay on a wheel and fires it in a kiln until it has become a material entirely other than what it was, hardened, watertight, durable across centuries. The baker who maintains the precise and particular heat of an oven through careful management of fuel and airflow and timing. The glass worker, where that craft reached the Greek world. The lime burner, the person who tends the fire beneath a bath, so that people can wash in warm water. Each of these is a practitioner of a craft that requires fire, and each of these crafts exists only because the fire Prometheus carried arrived in the human world and made it possible. Plato's Protagoras is making an explicit argument. The gift was not fire. The gift was everything that fire in skilled hands permits. In the smithy of Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, the lame god of the forge, who worked in fire by divine right, and whose workshop was understood to be located at the heart of a volcano, in the deepest heat available to the world, the fire that Prometheus stole had its most concentrated form. Hephaestus was the master of what fire could make. His workshop, in the tradition, produced objects of extraordinary quality: armor for the gods, thrones of unbreakable metal, gold and silver decorative work of such precision it surpassed anything human hands could manage. The fire in Hephaestus's forge was divine fire in its most applied and purposeful form, fire not simply burning, but fire doing work, fire under the control of the most skilled practitioner of craft in the divine order. When Prometheus took fire from that source, in the Platonic account, he was taking not only the element, but the principle of its application. The human smith who hammers hot bronze into shape is doing imperfectly and on a mortal scale what Hephaestus does divinely. The fire connects them. The craft connects them. The stolen gift is the bridge between the divine smith's workshop and the human one, and every time a smith in a Greek city directed fire to a specific purpose, shaping, hardening, fusing, refining, the act went back through the chain of transmission to the hollow fennel stalk and what it held. A Greek city's Prytanean deserves a moment of specific attention, not as an abstraction, but as a building, a physical place with a room at its center where the flame burned on a hearth, a simple hearth, circular or rectangular, surrounded by the kind of plain stonework that civic architecture in the Greek world typically used. The flame was not large. It did not need to be spectacular to do what it needed to do. It needed only to be continuous, to burn today as it burned yesterday, and as it would burn tomorrow. The sameness of the flame, the point of the flame, its persistence, the demonstration of the community's own persistence. Officials of the polis were responsible for it. It was fed at regular intervals. It was the first fire lit in a new city, and the last fire tended when a city ceased to be. Though in the Greek world, cities were generally reluctant to cease being, the flame in the Prytaneon was, in the mythological framework, a direct descendant of what Prometheus carried. The connection was not merely metaphorical in the ancient Greek understanding. It was understood as a genuine line of transmission, fire passing from the original source through every intermediate fire to the one burning now, in this building, in this city, on this particular afternoon. The fire had not been recreated from nothing each time it was needed. It had been carried forward. The same fire that Prometheus stole had traveled, in the Greek understanding, from the divine source into the mortal world, and from the mortal world outward into every fire that was ever lit from that original flame, and from those fires into every fire lit from them, and so on, across the centuries, in a branching chain that extended everywhere fire burned in the Greek world. This is what makes the image of the fennel stalk so quietly exact. The stalk is not a vessel that stores fire and then releases it, a container from which something is poured out and used up. It is a vehicle. It carries the ember across the distance between the source and the destination, and what arrives at the destination is not a diminished version of what was placed inside the stalk, not a copy or a representation, but the fire itself, the original fire, traveling far as Hesiod says it does, in something no larger than a walking staff. The distance between Olympus and the mortal world, in the Greek cosmological imagination, was not the distance between the peak of a mountain and the plain below it. It was the distance between orders of being, between the divine and the mortal, between what was eternal and what was subject to time, between what required no sustenance and what required everything. That distance was enormous in a way that had nothing to do with geography, and the fennel stalk crossed it. A pale, jointed, unremarkable plant stalk, common on every hillside around the Mediterranean, crossing the greatest distance in the Greek universe, with a line of heat moving quietly through its hollow interior. The mortal world that received the fire was not well prepared for it, in the mythological account. This is part of what makes the gift so consequential in the tradition. Human beings in the period before the gift of fire, in the period after Zeus had deliberately withheld it, in the particular cosmological moment that Hesiod is describing, were not in a good position. Without fire, the specific capacities that fire made possible were absent. The preparation of food, the working of metal, the warmth through cold seasons, the light through dark ones, all of it unavailable. The absence of fire, as Zeus had arranged it, was the absence of a very large portion of what made the human situation bearable. The gift, when it came, did not merely add something pleasant to an otherwise tolerable existence. It restored, or established for the first time, depending on how the sequence is read, the conditions under which the particular form of human life that the Greek world knew and practiced was possible. This is what the scholars of later generations understood Plato's Protagoras to be arguing in its careful retelling of the myth. Prometheus did not give human beings fire the way one might give a person a useful object they could then use or not use as they chose. He gave them the necessary precondition for being the kind of thing human beings are: civilization, the building of cities, the practice of crafts, the organization of communities around shared resources and shared governance. All of it depended, at the base of the chain, on the capacity to make and direct fire. Without fire, the other conditions for civilization could not be met. With fire, they became achievable. The ember inside the fennel stalk was, in this reading, not just a source of warmth, it was the basis of everything the human world had made of itself. The morning after the fire arrived, not a specific morning, not a date, but the mythological morning in which the gift became available, human beings could do things they had not been able to do the day before. The same hands that had been gathering food without the ability to cook it could now direct fire to the task of making the food something else. The same landscape that had held ore in its rock without anyone being able to extract and shape the metal could now, in principle, yield that ore to the heat of a forge and release what was in it. The same darkness that had been simply darkness could now be interrupted by a lamp, a torch, a hearth. These were not small changes. They were changes to the fundamental conditions of human life, and they came through the same channel, the ember in the stalk, traveling far, arriving in the mortal world intact. Hephaestus, in the context of the theft, is worth attending to as a figure in the background of the scene. He is the god of the forge, the divine craftsman, the maker of things from fire. In the Protagoras, the fire and the technical wisdom are taken from his workshop, alongside the domain of Athena. In Aeschylus's later treatment of the myth, the dramatization that came more than 2 centuries after Hesiod, Hephaestus is assigned a role in the punishment that follows the theft. It is Hephaestus who chains Prometheus to the rock in the Caucasus, and Aeschylus shows him performing this task with grief. But that comes later. In the moment of the theft itself, Hephaestus is not present in the text of Hesiod. His forge is simply the source. What the forge holds is taken. What the forge loses in this transaction is the exclusive possession of fire by the divine order, the monopoly, if it can be called that, by which the making of things from heat was restricted to the gods and their craft. The theft opened that monopoly. It made fire available to anyone who could carry it, feed it, direct it. It made the smith's work available to human hands that lacked the smith's divine precision, but now had his essential tool. The mortal world, after the ember arrived inside the fennel stalk, was a world in which the basic material of civilizational craft had become available to those who would spend their lives using it. The potters of the Keramikos quarter in Athens, the smiths of Corinth, the metalworkers across the Greek world whose livelihoods depended, practically and directly, on the fire that had crossed the distance from divine to mortal inside a hollow plant. The stalk, once the ember had been introduced to the pith, was carried. This is the image that Hesiod gives, and it is worth staying inside it for a moment before moving away from it. A stalk, held in the way one holds a walking staff, upright, or carried loosely along the side, or tucked beneath an arm. Nothing visible at the top, no flame emerging from the open end in a way that could be seen from a distance. The exterior of the plant giving nothing away, the same pale, jointed, unremarkable surface it always had, the surface that made the ferula communis ordinary to any eye that passed over it. And inside, through the length of the hollow interior, the pith slowly consuming itself around the ember, the heat moving through the fiber in its patient, invisible line, the fire traveling far through the darkness of the stalk's interior, carried across the distance between where it had been and where it was going. The mortal world was on the other side of that distance. The specific geography of the tradition places Olympus and the mortal world in a vertical relationship, the divine above, the human below, and the journey Prometheus made with the stalk was a journey downward, from the upper air, where the fire belonged to the landscape below, where it had been denied. The stalk descended with him. The ember inside it descended. At some point in the descent, the tradition does not specify exactly when, does not give a particular hillside or a moment of arrival. The fire crossed from one order of being to the other, inside its vessel, still burning, still patient, still giving no sign from the outside that it was there. The fire was already in the stalk. That is the detail that the myth preserves with the greatest precision, not the act of taking the fire, not the moment of placing the ember in the pith, but the fact of the fire being inside the stalk and moving, already traveling, already too far along the journey to be recalled. The decision had been made, the ember placed, the pith lit, and the plant sealed around it, and what remained was simply the carrying, the patient, unhurried transit of the fire from its source to its destination through a vessel that held it without showing it, across a distance that was, in every meaningful sense, the largest distance in the Greek universe. Something already in motion, something enclosed and warm, and feeding slowly on the material around it, too small to see, too quiet to hear, moving forward through the darkness of the stalk toward the open air on the other side. The fire traveling far, as Hesiod says, traveling far inside the hollow plant, across the space between the divine and the mortal, through the pale and jointed stalk that gave nothing away, that looked from the outside like nothing more than a plant someone had picked from the hillside, and was carrying, for reasons that needed no particular explanation, and inside it, the ember holding, the pith sustaining it, the fire already on its way, already past the point of turning back, moving forward through the dark interior of the stalk toward a world that did not yet know it was coming. A plain in the northeastern Peloponnese, before the ceremony begins. The air is still. The light falls evenly across flat ground and lies there without shadow, the way light does in the early part of a day that has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. This is Mekone, a name that older sources give to the place that would later be called Sicyon, a city that would stand on this same ground and carry the memory of what happened here forward through centuries without fully understanding it. Before the city, before the roads and the walls and the civic life of the later Greek world, Mekone is simply a plain where gods and mortal men have gathered, and the air before a ceremony has the particular quality of held breath, a stillness that is not absence, but anticipation, everything arranged, and nothing yet begun. The gathering at Mekone was, in the tradition Hesiod preserves, the first formal negotiation between the divine and the human, the moment when the terms of worship were settled, when the question of what gods receive and what mortals keep was worked out not by declaration, but by ceremony, and by the careful hands of a Titan whose name meant forethought. That name was already doing its work here, long before anyone at Mekone would have said so. The terms of sacrifice, what burns on the altar, and what is eaten at the table, would persist in the Greek world for as long as the Greek world sacrificed, which is to say, for as long as the Greek world existed in any form the Greeks themselves would have recognized. The moment at Mekone cast a shadow that was longer than most shadows the old stories cast, because it landed in the physical world and stayed there. What is laid out on the ground is a great ox already slaughtered, its life already complete. The animal is enormous. In the Greek sacrificial tradition, the ox was the most significant of offerings, the animal whose killing marked the most important ceremonies, civic festivals, dedications of temples, the settlements of oaths between cities and between men. Its size made it generous. Its domestic nature, fully integrated into the human world of labor and cultivation, made it appropriate. An ox was not a wild creature taken from outside the human order. It was a creature that had already lived inside it, and its sacrifice returned something that had always been, in some sense, part of the community's shared life. That weight, the social, economic, ritual weight of the animal, is already present before Prometheus approaches it. Before any deception, the ox means something. Prometheus approaches the carcass, and his hands begin to work through the division. Hesiod's account in the Theogony is patient and precise about this part of the story, and the precision matters because the whole point of what happens at Mekone is in the arrangement of surfaces. He sets the bones to one side. Thigh bones, dense and white, the structural architecture of the animal, stripped of everything that fed it and kept it moving. He drapes the fat over them, soft, glistening, pale as wool, when the sheep has just been washed, fragrant in the way animal fat always is when it is warm. The pile, dressed this way, looks generous. It looks like the better portion. The surface says, "Take this one." On the other side, he places the edible meat and the dark organs, the heart and lungs and viscera that would nourish, that carried the animal's life in their density and warmth. He hides this portion beneath the stomach lining of the ox. The lining is pale and unappetizing, a thing that signals plainness, that asks no attention, that makes the eye move away toward the other pile with its luminous fat and its air of abundance. The two portions sit facing each other across the space of the plain, and they already look like something other than what they are. One portion gleams, one portion is hidden. Prometheus, the Titan of forethought, has built a surface onto each of them, and the surfaces are the point. What Hesiod builds here, in those careful lines of the Theogony, is a story about appearance and what lies beneath it, but not in the way that phrase usually carries itself, heavily and with a lesson attached. The trick at Mashoni is not a moral fable with a tidy conclusion. It is something more specific and more interesting, the founding account of a practice that would be repeated with the same gesture at every Greek altar for centuries. The bones wrapped in fat are not merely a deception in a story. They are, in Hesiod's telling, the origin of the thing that happens at every sacrifice, the reason why the altar receives thigh bones wrapped in fat while the worshippers eat the meat. The myth carries the explanation inside it, the way the fennel stalk carries the ember, the way the name Prometheus carries its own meaning before anyone reads it. Zeus arrives. Rather, Zeus is present. The tradition does not describe an entrance so much as a presence already established, the divine gaze already at the ceremony, already aware that a choice is being offered. In Hesiod, Zeus lifts the white fat. He sees what is beneath it. The bones are there, dense and pale and nourishing to no one. The theogony is careful at this moment. It says that Zeus's heart was angered. It says this clearly and without softening, because the feeling is real within the tradition and deserves to be stated plainly. But Hesiod also makes clear that Zeus chose the fat-covered bones nonetheless, that the choice was made, that the portion was accepted, and that from this acceptance came the structure of Greek sacrifice that would persist for as long as anyone was making offerings at a Greek altar. This is the part of the Mythoni story that rewards attention, because on its surface it presents a puzzle. If Zeus saw through the deception, why did he choose the bones? The myth does not offer a psychological answer to this question, and the tradition is under no obligation to provide one. What the tradition preserves is something different: the fact that the terms were settled, that the division was made, and that what happened at Mythoni became what always happens afterward. The bones and fat rise in smoke from the altar. The meat feeds the community. This is the shape of sacrifice in the Greek world, repeated at Olympia and at Athens and at Delphi, and in every rural sanctuary where a stone altar stood, and an olive grove, and farmers brought what they could afford to burn. The myth explains the practice, but it also does something more. It holds inside it the specific moment when the practice began, a moment that both the gods and the humans present were part of, a negotiation that both sides were, in their way, party to. The word Hesiod uses for Prometheus at the opening of the Mycenae episode is megalometes, great-minded, or great in counsel. It is not a neutral word. It carries with it a recognition that the figure being described possesses something real, an intelligence that works carefully, that plans, that sees the arrangement before it is made visible to anyone else. Prometheus does not simply divide an ox. He divides it with forethought, with attention to what each surface will communicate, with awareness of what the eye is likely to choose when two portions are placed before it. The name of the character and the character's defining act at Mythoni are the same thing expressed in two different forms, and the tradition makes this connection quietly, without announcing it, in the way that the oldest mythological traditions often carry their meanings in the shape of a name or the structure of an act, rather than in any moment of explicit interpretation. The great ox at Mythoni was not the first animal sacrificed in the Greek world, and Mythoni was not the first place where a fire was lit and something was burned. The sacrificial tradition was already ancient by the time Hesiod was writing it down, already a practice so embedded in Greek civic and religious life that its origin would have seemed, to most participants, simply the way things had always been done. What the myth at Mythoni provides is not an origin in the archaeological sense. It does not claim to describe the first historical sacrifice, but an origin in the mythological sense, which is something different. It provides a story that accounts for the structure of a practice that already exists, that explains why the altar gets what it gets, and the worshippers keep what they keep, and that does so by placing that structure in a specific moment between specific figures in a specific place. This plane, this ox, these two portions, Zeus lifting the fat and seeing what lies beneath it. The fat itself deserves attention for a moment, because in Hesiod's account it is not incidental. Glistening is the word the text reaches for. Gleaming, soft, visually rich. Animal fat in the ancient Mediterranean world was not a waste product or an afterthought. It was used in lamps, in cooking, in the treatment of leather, in ritual anointing. Its presence on the bones at Mecone signals abundance, not as a deception invented for the occasion, but because fat genuinely was associated with richness and generosity in the material world of the tradition. The trick works, in Hesiod's telling, not because Prometheus has created a false signal out of nothing, but because he has taken a signal that already means something in the world and placed it on top of something that does not deserve it. The fat means wealth. The fat means generosity. The fat means choose this one. And the fact that it is draped over bones is something the fat cannot communicate, because surfaces can only speak for themselves. Somewhere in the northeastern Peloponnese, on the ground where Mecone stood before the city of Sicyon replaced it, there is no longer any altar, and no longer any plain arranged for ceremony. The city of Sicyon eventually became a real Greek city with its own history, its own coins, its own moments in the political and military life of the classical world. It stood on ground that the mythological tradition had consecrated without the city's knowledge, in the way that many real places in the Greek world carried the weight of mythological memory without anyone who walked through them on an ordinary day, particularly feeling that weight. The ground at Mecone is simply ground. The ox is long since past imagining, but the tradition that the ceremony at Mecone established, bones and fat on the altar, meat kept for the living, went on being practiced at altars that were very real in cities and sanctuaries across the Greek world for centuries. At Olympia, where the great altar of Zeus stood, and where the famous games were held every 4 years in his honor, the altar was itself composed partly of the accumulated ash of sacrificial bones, centuries of offerings compressed into a mound of pale ash that grew taller over time, slowly, the way a thing grows when it is added to regularly and never taken away. The altar at Olympia was made in part of Mecone. Every ox whose bones were burned there contributed to the structure that received the next offering, so that the altar contained within itself the record of all the sacrifices that had preceded the current one, all the way back through time toward the moment the tradition described as the first. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, describes this altar with the careful attention of someone who found its composition genuinely interesting, a man standing before a structure built of ash and bone, noting its height and texture, aware that he was looking at the accumulated weight of a very long practice. Zeus's response to the division at Mecone, in Hesiod's account, was to withhold fire from mortal men. This is the detail that follows directly from the deception, not a punishment directed at Prometheus alone, but a withholding aimed at the beings on whose behalf Prometheus had arranged the trick. The tradition in Works and Days describes Zeus acting in anger at heart, hiding fire from the mortal race, presenting the world without fire as a diminished world, a world in which human beings were left with something missing, something they had not previously lacked and now could not replace. The structure of the response is interesting because it is indirect. Zeus does not punish the Titan who deceived him by addressing the Titan. He punishes the humans who benefited. It is a response shaped by the logic of the negotiation at Mecone, where the question was always about what mortals receive and what the gods keep, and where the withholding of fire closes the door that the meat-keeping had left open. There is something in the structure of this response that the tradition does not interpret for the listener, and that the tradition is under no obligation to interpret. What Hesiod documents is the sequence, the deception at Mecone, the anger, the withholding of fire. The causal chain is clear. The reasoning behind the specific form of the response, why fire, why this particular thing, the tradition leaves to be understood through what fire means in the world the myth describes. Fire is cooking. Fire is warmth in winter. Fire is the light that keeps the dark back, and the forge that makes the tools that make cultivation possible. To take fire from mortal men is not merely to take one useful thing among many. It is to take the thing that sits at the center of the human relationship with the material world, the thing that processes what the earth provides and makes it into something the body can use, the thing that gathers people together around its warmth after the sun goes down. In the Greek world, fire and human civilization were not easily separated. The one presupposed the other. A Greek hearth fire was not merely practical, though it was certainly that. The hearth, the hesteia, was at the center of the household, in a sense that was simultaneously architectural, religious, and social. The goddess Hesteia, whose name was also the word for the hearth itself, presided over it. Offerings were made at the household hearth before any meal, a first portion given to the goddess before the family ate. In the civic sphere, the Prytaneon, the administrative heart of a Greek city, maintained a sacred fire that burned continuously, tended by designated officials, kept alive through every season and through every crisis the city endured. This civic fire was understood as the spiritual center of community life, the living token of the city's coherence, the thing that linked the household fires of individual citizens to the collective life of the polis. When colonists left a Greek city to found a new settlement elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, they carried fire from the mother city's Prytaneon to light the hearth of the new city, a practice that made fire the medium through which community was transmitted across distance and across time. All of that, the household hearth, the civic fire, the colonial flame, carried across the sea, existed in the world that Hesiod's myth described as the world without fire. The withholding of fire at Mecone, in the tradition's telling, was not simply the removal of a useful tool. It was the removal of the entire structure that fire made possible, the warmth, the cooking, the civic coherence, the religious practice, the transmission of community from one generation to the next. What Prometheus would later restore by carrying fire back across the distance between Olympus and the mortal world was not merely warmth. It was the civilizational complex that fire anchored, the full human arrangement that could not exist without the fire at its center. The plain at Mecone, in the tradition Hesiod preserves, was the place where that arrangement was first put at risk, where the terms of the relationship between gods and mortals were tested, and where the test produced a consequence that shaped everything that came after. It is a story about negotiation that ends not with agreement, but with a withholding, not with the terms settled to everyone's satisfaction, but with the table partially cleared, one thing taken back, the division at Mecone, producing a second division that no one at Mecone had anticipated, when the ceremony began. The ox was divided into two portions. The fire was then removed from one of the parties to that division. The logic holds inside the story with the tight, almost mechanical consistency of something that has been told many times and kept only what survived the telling. Hesiod does not pause to editorialize at Mecone. He does not comment on the fairness or unfairness of the arrangement, does not position the Titan's trick or Zeus's response within a larger moral frame that would tell the listener what to think about either party. He describes what happened with the same even attention he gives to genealogies and the names of rivers, the same unhurried precision that the oldest mythological sources bring to everything they record. The bones were wrapped in fat. Zeus chose the fat-covered bones. Zeus's heart was angered. Fire was withheld from mortals. The sequence is clear, and the recording is neutral, and the tradition trusts the listener to sit with the complexity of a story, in which a trick is played, a punishment is issued, and neither party is straightforwardly in the right or the wrong, because the terms of the relationship between divine and human were never straightforward to begin with. What persists in the world from the ceremony at Mecone is not the ceremony itself, which belongs to the mythological time before the present world took its current shape. What persists is the practice the ceremony established, the practice of Greek animal sacrifice, in which the altar received the bones wrapped in fat, and the community kept the meat, a division that was repeated at every major festival in the Greek religious calendar. This practice is among the most extensively documented in the ancient world. Homer describes it in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great communal sacrifices before battle and after victory. The animals led to the altar and the divine portions separated with the same careful arrangement that Hesiod traces back to Mecone. Greek religious inscriptions from hundreds of sanctuaries across the classical world specify in administrative detail what should be burned and what should be distributed, how the altar's portion is to be wrapped and placed, what the priests receive, and what the wider community shares. The practice was codified and administered and regulated, and its origin in the mythological tradition was that plain in the northeastern Peloponnese, where a Titan laid out two portions, and a god chose between them. At the altar of Zeus at Nemea, where another of the great Pan-Hellenic festivals took place, the sacrifice of the ox was the central ceremony of the games, not merely a preliminary to the athletic competition, but the event that gave the competition its sacred character, the act that placed the games within the framework of divine worship rather than mere human sport. The bones and fat burned on the altar while the athletes prepared to compete, and the smoke that rose from the burning was directed, in the tradition's understanding, toward the divine world that received it. The god received what Mecone had determined was his portion, and the humans received what Mecone had determined was theirs. The division, made once in mythological time, was made again at Nemea, and at Olympia, and at the Panathenaic festival in Athens, and at the Thesmophoria, and at the Dionysia, and at every sanctuary where an altar stood, and a fire was lit, and something living was brought into the presence of the divine, and then divided according to the terms that a Titan had arranged on a plain that later became a city called Sicyon. The ash altar at Olympia grew taller over centuries. The accumulation of that division made material, the weight of all those separated portions pressing downward into the ground. Pausanias measured it, or at least estimated its height, and described its pale color and its composition with the same careful attention he gave to temples and sculptures, and rivers and the faces of statues. He was a man who traveled through the Greek world in an era when much of the older tradition had already become historical, already a thing to be visited and described, rather than practiced in the same terms the older Greeks would have recognized. He stood before the ash altar and recorded what he saw, and what he saw was centuries of accumulated meconi, the ongoing material consequence of a mythological negotiation that had been replayed in offerings of bone and fat at this site for as long as the games had been held, and longer. The ceremony at Meconi, in the version the tradition preserves, concluded without celebration. Zeus chose. Zeus saw the bones beneath the fat. The heart angered. The withdrawal of fire followed. The gathering dispersed without the satisfaction of a negotiation successfully completed on all sides, without the warmth that a successful ceremony might have produced, without the sense of terms agreed and order confirmed. What it produced instead was a gap in the mortal world, the absence of fire, and a Titan who stood on one side of that gap, with his characteristic forethought already working, the arrangement of the next act already beginning to take shape in the way that all the acts of Prometheus take shape. Carefully, quietly, with attention to surfaces and to what can be carried inside something that looks like nothing of consequence. Somewhere between the ceremony at Meconi and the mortal world where fire was now absent, the fennel plant grows tall along the roadsides and in the dry ground of the Mediterranean coast, its pale jointed stalk rising to the height of a person, its interior hollow and pithy and capable of holding, in the right conditions, a slow-burning ember for a sustained period without showing anything on the outside. The plant was already there before the story needed it. The tradition noticed what the plant could carry. The detail is so specific. Ferula communis, the giant fennel, the narthex, that it carries the weight of genuine botanical observation, of someone who knew the plant and knew what its interior could hold, and found in that knowledge a story about how fire traveled from one world to another inside something that looked from the outside like an ordinary walking staff. Hesiod's Works and Days describes the theft with the plain declarative style he uses for the most consequential moments. Prometheus stole fire that travels far in a hollow fennel stalk. The fire travels far. It moves. It is not stored or fixed. It is already in motion from the moment it enters the stalk, already crossing the distance between the divine source and the mortal world that has been left without it. The image is a quiet one, a tall pale plant held upright, something warm moving through its interior, the outside unremarkable and dry, the inside carrying something that will change everything when it arrives. The smoke from a Greek sacrificial altar rising from thigh bones wrapped in fat at the Olympus ceremony, or at the festival of Athena, or at any of the dozens of sanctuaries that documented their practices in stone inscriptions still readable today, rises with the particular quality of fat burning at high heat, white and dense, moving upward with purpose, dissipating into the open sky above the altar as it rises. The worshippers behind the altar, dividing the cooked meat, pass portions to one another in the way that the ceremonies specify, the allocation carefully structured so that priests and magistrates and ordinary citizens each receive what the occasion entitles them to. The fire on the altar was lit before the sacrifice began and will be maintained through the ceremony and beyond it. The fire is already there, already given, already burning in the human world where Meconi determined it would burn. That fire has been burning for a very long time. In the historical record, the practices that the Meconi story accounts for, the altar's portion and the community's portion, the fat and bones consumed upward toward the divine, and the meat consumed at the table by the living, are traceable through archaeological evidence and textual documentation across many centuries of Greek religious life. The bone deposits at sanctuary sites, including Olympia, are physical evidence of the practice, actual bones, many of them clearly divided in the manner the tradition describes, accumulated in the places where the altars stood. The myth and the material record speak to the same practice, the one explaining what the other preserves. Mecone is in the bones at Olympia, the way the name Prometheus carries its meaning inside it, already present, already structuring what follows, not requiring a sign. The plain in the northeastern Peloponnese where the ceremony took place was called Mecone, and later the city of Sicyon stood there, and later still the city declined, and the ground returned to something quieter, as ground tends to do when the cities that stood on it are finished. But the ceremony that took place at Mecone, in the tradition Hesiod recorded, did not need the plain in order to persist. It traveled forward in the practice, the same way fire traveled forward inside the stalk, inside the structure of what the Greeks did at every altar, inside the allocation of portions, inside the particular arrangement of bones, wrapped in white gleaming fat, placed on the altar fire, while the community kept the meat for the meal that followed. That arrangement was Mecone's continuing presence in the world, still operating centuries after the plain itself had become a city, and the city had become something else entirely. Sacrificial smoke, rising from an altar at a Greek sanctuary, at Olympia, at Delphi, at the Parthenon, at any of the sanctuaries that archaeology and inscription and the careful attention of writers like Pausanias have preserved in documented detail, carried with it, in the tradition's understanding, the portion that the ceremony at Mecone had settled belonged to the divine. The smoke moved upward with its payload of burning fat, the surface still performing its function even in combustion, still signaling abundance, still moving in the direction of the world from which it had been determined the divine portion should come. Beneath that smoke, on the altar and at the tables around it, the human portion remained in the human world, held there by the same settlement that sent the rest upward. The division made once at Mecone was being made again, and again, and again, at every altar and at every festival, in the smoke that rose from one world toward another, in the meat that stayed in the world where the worshippers lived, in the careful hands that made the separation and placed each portion where Mecone had determined it should go. That settlement is still there in the record. It is in Hesiod's lines, precise and patient, the bones and the fat, described with the attention of a writer who understood that the story he was telling accounted for something that still happened in the world around him. It is in the ash mound at Olympia, which accumulated for centuries and was described by Pausanias, and is known to archaeologists as a real and measurable feature of the sanctuary site. It is in the inscriptions from Greek sanctuaries across the ancient world that specify in administrative terms what the altar receives and what the community keeps, regulations that presuppose the settlement at Mecone without ever needing to name it, the way a city's water system presupposes the river without acknowledging it each time someone drinks. The ceremony at Mecone left a real mark on the world, and the mark remained long after the ceremony was remembered only in the telling of the story. Long after the plain became a city, and the city became a ruin, and the ruin became ground again, the smoke from all those altars long since dispersed into the sky and gone, and the practice they enacted still continuing, and the bones still burning, and the fat still gleaming in the altar fire, as it always had, still performing the function that Prometheus arranged for it on that still morning in the northeastern Peloponnese, before anything in the story had yet begun to move. The Caucasus Mountains, as the ancient Greeks understood them, stood at the far northeastern edge of the world they could name and map, beyond the Black Sea, beyond the rivers the Greeks called by their old Scythian names, beyond the grasslands where nomadic peoples moved with their herds across distances that Greek geographers could only approximate, the Caucasus rose as a wall between the known world and what lay beyond it. Hesiod and the poets who worked in the same tradition placed them at the outermost margin of the inhabited earth. They were not simply a distant range. They were the place where distance itself ended, where the organized world gave way to something that had no civic name, no temple, no familiar road. A traveler going there would not be going somewhere. A traveler going there would be leaving the human world by degrees, walking toward the edge of the map until the map ran out and only the mountains remained. The peaks of the Caucasus, as Greek geographical thought imagined them, were enormous in the way that things at the edge of the world tend to be enormous, not precisely measured, not described with the particular detail of a place anyone had stood inside and drawn, but large with the largeness of the unknown, which is always larger than any specific measurement could contain. The slopes were bare. The air at the upper reaches was the cold air of altitude and distance, thin in the lungs and bright with a light that had no warmth in it. Below the peaks, where rock gave way to the upper edge of whatever vegetation the altitude allowed, there was the particular silence of a place very far from any other living thing. The silence of the Caucasus in the Greek geographical imagination was not the silence of a room or a grove or a shrine. It was the silence of the world before cities were built in it, wide, consistent, indifferent to whoever or whatever might be present within it. This is where the punishment was placed, not at the edge of a city, not at a crossroads with a name, not in a landscape the Greeks had walked through and described. From the inside, the location was chosen for its distance, and the distance was chosen for what distance does to a thing. It removes it from witness, from remedy, from the everyday circulation of the world, and leaves it simply there, continuing, with no audience and no relief close enough to matter. Hesiod, in the Theogony, describes the punishment without theatrical elaboration. The Titan Prometheus, who had stolen fire from Zeus and carried it down to mortal men in the hollow stalk of a fennel plant, was bound to a rock. Zeus commanded it, and the binding was accomplished with bonds described as unbreakable, chains of a kind that the divine forge could produce, and that no human or ordinary divine effort could loosen. The rock and the chains and the distance were the architecture of the punishment, and Hesiod lays them out with the same declarative evenness he uses to describe genealogies and the ordering of the cosmos. This happened. It was arranged this way. The terms of the arrangement were as follows. It is in Aeschylus's dramatic treatment, the play known as Prometheus Bound, that the scene of the chaining acquires its fullest texture. Aeschylus presents the moment not as a fait accompli, already completed before the story begins, but as a scene unfolding in real time, with characters present and speaking. Hephaestus is there, the divine smith, the maker of things in metal and fire, the god whose craft was the shaping of whatever the forge could shape. He is not alone. Beside him stand two figures, whose names in Greek describe their function with the directness that Greek divine naming often employed. Kratos, who is power, and Bia, who is force. These two are the instruments of the command. They have brought Prometheus to the rock, and they are present to ensure the chaining is completed. What Aeschylus makes visible in this scene is the quality of Hephaestus's participation. He performs the task. He drives the bonds into the stone. His hands, which are the hands of the finest craftsmen in the divine order, accomplish the work they have been assigned. But in Aeschylus's account, he does not accomplish it without cost to himself. His lines in the play carry a weight of reluctance and grief that Kratos, beside him, explicitly dismisses. Kratos is cold in the way that law is cold. What has been commanded will be done, and the feelings of the person carrying out the command are not relevant to the execution. The command came from Zeus. The chains are what they are. Hephaestus's grief is acknowledged and then set aside, because the function of the scene is not to examine the feelings of those who administer a punishment, but to complete the administration of it. The reluctance of Hephaestus in Aeschylus is not a minor detail. It places the chaining within a structure of divine hierarchy and compulsion. Hephaestus does not refuse, cannot refuse, but his documented sorrow creates a kind of moral texture within the scene itself, a suggestion that even within the divine order, there are acts performed against inclination, commands followed by those who find them hard. The smith who works in fire, whose whole existence is bound to the forge and the shaping of metal, is the one sent to bind the figure who gave fire to human beings. There is a structure in that arrangement, an internal correspondence that the ancient sources do not comment on directly, but that the composition of the scene itself holds quietly. When the chaining is complete in Aeschylus's account, the figures present depart. Kratos and Baia leave. Hephaestus leaves. Prometheus is alone on the rock, in the Caucasus, at the edge of the world, in chains that the god of the forge himself has set. The play continues from there. Prometheus speaks, figures arrive, and depart. The drama unfolds through dialogue and visitation. But beneath all of that theatrical structure is the simple, enormous image that the punishment creates. A figure bound to a cliff at the edge of the known world, alone, the mountains around him empty, the chains holding exactly as they were made to hold. Each morning, from the Greek tradition's account, the eagle came. Hesiod names it in the Theogony, with the same compactness he brings to most of his divine genealogies. The bird is described as long-winged, a detail that gives it the specific quality of a creature built for vast distances, for the upper air, for the kind of sustained flight that covers the geography between Olympus and the Caucasus, as if that distance were simply a feature of its daily movement. The ancient sources identify it as the Aetos Caucasios, the Caucasian eagle, and Hesiod records it as having been born of Typhon and Echidna, that pairing of monstrous progenitors who produced many of the great hostile creatures of the Greek mythological tradition. The eagle was not simply a large bird, it was a creature with a specific genealogical position within the order of things, a creature whose nature had been shaped by what it came from, and whose function at the rock of Prometheus was not incidental to that origin, but continuous with it. The approach of the eagle each morning would have been, in the Greek imagination, a thing of slow clarity. The Caucasus was bare and open. There was no concealment, no forest through which a sound might come before a shape appeared. The approach was visible from a great distance, a shape descending from the upper sky, growing larger as it came, following the same line it had followed every previous morning, toward the same cliff, to the same place on the rock. Whether the morning was clear or overcast, whether the wind came from one direction or another, the eagle arrived. The regularity of its arrival was part of the structure of the punishment. It did not come unpredictably, at random hours, as a threat that might materialize at any moment, or might not. It came in the morning as mornings came, and in that sense, the approach of the eagle and the approach of each new day had become, over the duration of the punishment, simply the same event experienced from two different angles. The eagle consumed the liver. The tradition is specific about this. Not another organ, not the general consumption of flesh. The liver, specifically, each day, taken by the eagle over the course of the daylight hours, and by the following morning restored, full, intact, as it had been the morning before. This specificity is not arbitrary. The liver held a particular position in ancient Greek understanding of the body that made it the exact right organ for a punishment of this structure. Across the Greek world and across the broader Mediterranean civilizations with which the Greeks traded, traveled, and shared intellectual traditions, the liver was understood as the seat of life itself, the organ in which blood was generated, in which the vitality of the living body was concentrated and renewed. It was not, in this tradition, merely one organ among others. It was the central one, the one from which life radiated outward into the rest of the body. This understanding of the liver gave it a place in ritual practice that no other organ shared quite so fully. Hepatoscopy, the examination of the liver of a sacrificed animal, was a widespread divinatory practice across the ancient Mediterranean world, and it was practiced in Greek sanctuaries as well as Mesopotamian ones. The priests and diviners who carried out this practice examined the organ with care, reading its lobes and fissures and surface features for information about what the gods intended, about the outcome of military campaigns or civic decisions or individual futures. The liver was the place where the divine could be read in the mortal body, where the interior of a living thing opened in the hands of someone who knew how to look onto information that came from outside the human world entirely. To take the liver, then, was to take what was most alive in a living thing. To take it daily and to return it nightly was to construct a punishment of perfect, unresolvable rhythm, neither lethal, because the organ returned, nor livable, because the taking recurred. The punishment did not move toward an end. It did not escalate toward a final consequence. It simply repeated at the same hour, with the same instrument, at the same location on the same cliff, with the same result. The eagle arrived. The liver was taken. The eagle departed. The night passed. The liver was restored. The morning came, and the eagle arrived again. The duration of the punishment, as the ancient sources record it, is a matter that different writers handled differently. Hesiod, in his treatment of the myth, emphasizes the self-renewing structure of the torment rather than specifying a number of years. What he conveys is the sense of a cycle that does not wind down, a punishment whose form is precisely its repeatability rather than its finitude. Later writers, including Hyginus and Apollodorus, attached figures to the duration. Some sources speak of 30,000 years. Others calibrate the time frame against the heroic age, setting the liberation within a genealogical sequence that allowed the story to have an eventual resolution. These varying accounts do not contradict each other so much as they describe the same central quality of the punishment from different angles, that it was vast, that it was structured to persist, that the figure at its center was held within a cycle from which ordinary time offered no escape. What the varying accounts agree on is the geography and the instrument and the organ, the Caucasus, the eagle, the liver. These three remain consistent across the tradition's different voices, and their consistency gives the punishment a kind of solidity that the variations in duration do not disturb. A punishment that lasted 30,000 years, and a punishment that was simply described as ongoing share. The same essential quality. They are both punishments whose endpoint is not the point. The mountains in the evening, after the eagle had gone, would have had the quality that high, empty places have at the close of a clear day, the light changing from its full midday brightness to something lower and more golden, and then to the particular blue that precedes the dark in mountain landscapes, a color that has no warmth in it, but is not quite the cold of true night. The air at that altitude in that remote part of the world as the Greeks imagined it, would have carried the quality of absolute quiet, not the silence of a place where people live and are simply not making noise, but the silence of a place where there is nothing to make noise, where the only sounds are the sounds the wind makes moving across stone and the sounds that stone makes in the cold. In that evening silence, the tradition holds, the liver was already restoring itself. The regeneration was not described in ancient sources as a gradual or visible process. It is simply a fact of the punishment structure that what was taken returned, that the organ which had been consumed by morning was whole again by morning. How the restoration worked, what the mechanism of that renewal was understood to be, is not elaborated in the texts that carry the myth. What the tradition preserves is the fact of the renewal and its timing, which was calibrated precisely to the eagle's return. The liver was never restored before the eagle came, and it was never still incomplete when the eagle arrived. It was whole, and then it was taken, and then by the time the eagle would come again, it was whole once more. The cycle was as precise as the movement of the sun, as regular as the tides, as indifferent to anything the chained figure might feel or wish or know as the turning of the seasons. This precision is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is what distinguishes this punishment from one that simply causes suffering. A punishment that only caused suffering could end in one of two ways. It could kill, or the sufferer could become accustomed to it, and in either case the punishment would eventually lose its character. The structure of the Prometheus punishment closes both of those exits. The regeneration prevents the killing. The daily renewal of the organ prevents the formation of the habit. Every morning the liver is as full and complete as it was the first morning, and every morning the taking of it is as total as it was the first time. There is no diminishment and no accommodation. The punishment simply continues, fresh in its terms, regular in its rhythm, complete in its repetition. In Aeschylus's dramatic treatment of the myth, Prometheus speaks at length. He speaks to the daughters of Oceanus, the Oceanids, who arrive to hear him. He speaks to Io, who arrives in the midst of her own suffering, her own divine punishment. He speaks about what he knows, and in Aeschylus's version, what Prometheus knows includes a secret about the future of Zeus's rule, a knowledge that gives the chained titan a position of strange leverage within the very punishment meant to render him powerless. This element of the dramatic tradition adds a layer to the punishment structure that is not present in Hesiod's more compressed account, the idea that the one being punished holds information the punisher needs, that the chain runs in both directions, in some sense, that knowledge and power do not align with the positions of the chain. But the secret and the speeches and the Aeschylean drama all happen in front of the rock. Behind all of it, beneath all of it, is the simple arrangement: the rock, the chains, the eagle, the liver, the night, the restoration, and the morning. These elements persist across every version of the myth, regardless of what dramatic or philosophical or theological scaffolding is built around them. They are the myth's skeleton, and every version of the story, however varied its flesh, is organized around the same bones. The rock itself, in the Greek imagination, was not merely a surface to which the chains were attached. It was a location at the edge of the world, and being at the edge of the world meant being at the edge of the human world, specifically at the limit of the zone in which the gods moved among people, in which sacrifices were made, and prayers were spoken, and the divine and the mortal circulated in the same shared geography. Beyond that edge, the myth places Prometheus not in darkness, or in the underworld, or in any of the other zones, the Greek cosmology reserved for the dead and the punished. He is in the open air. He is visible in principle to the sky above him. He is on the surface of the world, under the same sun that rises over Athens and Corinth, and Thebes and the islands of the Aegean. He is simply at the edge of the world, where no one else is, and where no help is close enough to reach him in time for anything to be different before morning comes again. The long-winged eagle, born of Typhon and Echidna, arrived each morning from somewhere above, from the upper air, from the height toward which eagles in fact fly when they are not hunting, that particular altitude where a large bird can soar without effort, reading the thermals that rise from the heated rock below. The Greeks knew eagles. They were present in the landscapes of mainland Greece and across the Aegean, and they were associated with Zeus. The eagle was the bird of Zeus in Greek iconography, his messenger and his attribute, the creature whose form he sometimes took. There is a structure, again, in this association, the punishment delivered through a creature that carries the emblem of the punisher, the eagle that belongs to Zeus, arriving each morning at the rock of Zeus's prisoner. The instrument of the punishment is marked with the authority that authorized it. The eagle descended and performed what it came to perform, and then, in the tradition's spare account, it departed. It went back to wherever such a creature spent the hours between one morning's arrival and the next. Whether it returned to Olympus, whether it flew to some other part of the world, whether it had any existence in the myth outside of its function at the rock, the ancient sources do not elaborate. It arrived, it consumed what was given to be consumed, and it left. Its departures were as regular as its arrivals. After it left, the rock was the rock again, stone and chains and the vast silence of the Caucasus, and the slow progress of the afternoon toward evening. The sun moved across the sky above the mountains, as it moved across the sky everywhere else, with the same unhurried motion, indifferent to what was happening at the cliff face below. The shadows on the rock lengthened, the light changed. The temperature fell as it falls in any mountain landscape. When the day is ending and the air begins to give back the heat it gathered during the daylight hours. By the time the dark was full and the night was settled over the Caucasus, the liver had already begun its return. Or rather, the liver was returned because the tradition does not describe the process, only the result. What the dawn would find when the light came back was an organ restored to its wholeness, ready again for what the morning would bring. The cycle was complete, and in being complete, it was also immediately beginning again. The restoration was also the preparation. The renewal was also the reassembly of everything that the next morning's eagle would require. There is something in the structure of this punishment that the ancient sources do not comment on explicitly, but that the arrangement itself seems to contain, the idea that the punishment has the form of a kind of sustained attention, that the eagle's regularity and the liver's regularity and the rock's fixed position create a system as organized and as indifferent as any natural cycle, turning as the seasons turn, as the tides turn, as the sun moves across the sky above the bare peaks of the Caucasus. The chains hold, the eagle comes, the liver restores, the morning comes again. These things happen not because anyone is watching them happen, or because anyone is ensuring they continue, but because the punishment has been set in motion with enough precision that it continues on its own terms, as the stars continue on theirs. The tradition holds that this continued for a very long time, longer than any human life, longer than any sequence of human generations that could be witnessed in a single historical memory. The mountains that held the rock were the same mountains decade after decade. The cliff face where the chains were driven was the same cliff face, unchanged by the daily arrival of the eagle, unchanged by the daily passage of time over stone. The Caucasus did not register the punishment the way a city registers the events that happen in its streets, with accumulated marks, with stories that change the place. The mountains were simply there, as they had been before the punishment began, as they would be after its terms were eventually altered. The figure on the rock was not aging in the way mortal figures age. The punishment was not diminishing him, because the liver's restoration prevented diminishment. He was held in a kind of terrible stasis, not dead, not dying, not healing toward wholeness, because wholeness was perpetually undone and perpetually returned. The chains held him in place, and the cycle of the eagle held him in a particular relationship with time, not moving through it toward anything, but simply persisting within it, as the mountains persisted, as the sky above the mountains persisted, as the cold wind that moved across the bare slopes persisted without beginning or end. This is the structure that the ancient sources describe and preserve across their varying accounts. Hesiod's compact declarative version, Aeschylus's dramatic and dialogue-rich theatrical version, the later mythographers who attached figures to the duration and placed the eventual liberation within a genealogical timeline. All of them are describing the same fundamental arrangement: the far place, the unbreakable bonds, the long-winged eagle, the liver that was the seat of life, and the night that restored what the day had taken away. What the punishment holds at its center as a mythological structure is not primarily a narrative of suffering, but a narrative of precision. Every element of it has been calibrated to function. The location removes Prometheus from the human world and from any casual possibility of rescue. The bonds prevent any effort at self-liberation. The eagle is born of the most monstrous parentage the tradition can provide, ensuring it is not a creature that could be persuaded or redirected. The liver, as the seat of life, is the organ whose taking is most total without being fatal, and the regeneration ensures that the totalness of the taking is reset each day, so that the punishment never loses its sharpness through repetition. Each component functions, and the components function together, and what they produce together is a system of such thoroughness that it requires nothing to maintain it. It runs on its own terms, in the empty mountains, far from the world where the myth would be told for centuries, around fires that burned with the fire Prometheus had carried there. The rock in the evening, the chains against the stone, the cold air of the Caucasus settling around the cliff face as the last light left the peaks, the liver, in the dark, reassembling itself in the quiet, whole again, warm again, ready for the morning that would come as it had always come, bringing the light and the cold, and somewhere above in the upper air, the long wings of the eagle already beginning their descent from a height where the air is thin and the world below is visible in all its distances. The mountains and the bare slopes and the single cliff, with its chains and its prisoner and its particular, regular appointment with the dawn, by the time morning arrived, and the sky above the Caucasus had moved from dark to that particular gray that precedes the sun, before the first light reached the cliff face, and before the shadows had yet taken their daytime shapes, the liver was intact, whole, precisely as it had been at the start of the previous day, precisely as it would be at the start of the next. The cycle had returned to its beginning. The eagle, somewhere in the upper air, had already oriented itself toward the cliff. The morning was indistinguishable from every other morning on that rock, which was the point, which was the whole architecture of it, a punishment that looked from the outside like the simple, patient, repetitive turning of the world. At the northwestern edge of Athens, where the city's noise thinned and the ground opened into a grove of old olive trees, there was an altar made of pale stone, It stood in the shade at the beginning of a path. The trees around it were not remarkable trees. They were the ordinary olive trees of Attica, gray-leaved and patient, their trunks thickened by decades into shapes that suggested long waiting. The altar itself was not large. It was the kind of structure that could be passed without noticing if the season were wrong and the grove were empty and no one had lit the torch. On certain days the season was right and the grove was not empty and the torch was always lit. Runners assembled at the altar of Prometheus in the Academy Grove before the race began. They stood in the early evening light with their torches already burning, the flames small and specific against the open air, the smoke rising in thin, pale lines before the wind took it. The altar had been there long enough that no one in the city could remember its founding. It was simply one of the fixed things of Athenian life, like the shape of the Acropolis against the sky, or the sound of the Kerameikos quarter at work before dawn. From this altar, on the day of the festival, runners would carry the fire of Prometheus through the streets of the city, passing it from hand to hand, keeping it burning across the whole length of the route. This was the lampadodromia. The name comes from lampus, torch, and dromos, race, or course, or the running of a thing. It was not a race in the way that other Greek races were races, measuring the speed of one body against another over a fixed distance. Its measure was different. What mattered was whether the flame arrived still burning. A runner who crossed the finish line with an extinguished torch had not arrived at all, in the terms the festival understood. The fire was the point. The runner was the vessel. Pausanias, writing his description of Greece several centuries after the festival was already ancient, confirms the altar in the Academy Grove as the race's origin. His account is brief and practical. The altar is there. The race begins there. The fact requires no ceremony of explanation, because by his time it is simply known. Plato, writing earlier, mentions the torch race at the beginning of the Republic in a passage so casual that the race appears as background, a thing the narrator has been to see that evening, ordinary enough to name without pause, the way one names an errand completed. The lampadoromia was familiar enough in 5th and 4th century Athens that a philosopher could drop it into a sentence and expect his reader to know exactly what he meant. What Plato mentions, and what Pausanias confirms, locates a living practice in a real place, a grove northwest of the city, an altar of pale stone, runners with torches at the starting line, and the fire moving through them into the city where it would arrive, still burning, at the end. The myth of Prometheus was not only a story the Athenians told, it was a ceremony they performed, annually, in a grove that had been set aside for it. The ember in the fennel stalk had become, by the time of the classical city, a torch in a runner's hand, carrying the same fire across a different distance, and the ritual was understood to be, in some specific and undramatic way, a continuation of the original act. The grove itself had a history before its Promethean association. The Academy, the gymnasium that would later give its name to Plato's school of philosophy, was already an established training ground for Athenian ephebas, the young men of the city undergoing their civic formation, when the philosophical circle gathered there. The olive trees were old by then. The path from the altar to the city had been worn by years of racing feet. When Plato established his school in the Academy Grove, he placed it in a landscape that already carried the name of Prometheus on its oldest fixed stone, so that the philosophy being practiced in the shade of those trees existed in close proximity to the myth it would eventually retell. Protagoras, in the dialogue Plato wrote in his name, retells the Promethean myth in a way that shifts its weight toward a specific set of questions. In his account, Prometheus does not steal fire alone. He takes fire and technical wisdom together, Sophia Demiurgi, the practical skill of making things, from the workshops of Hephaestus and Athena, carrying both to the human beings who had been left without defenses. Epimetheus had already distributed the animal's qualities: speed to the deer, thick hide to the ox, warm fur to the bear, and by the time he reached the humans, there was nothing left to give. Prometheus gave them fire because there was nothing else, and because fire in this account carries the full weight of civilizational technique. What he gave was not only warmth and light, he gave the capacity to smelt ore and shape metal, to fire clay and make vessels, to cook food and alter it into something other than what it was in the field. He gave the possibility of the forge, the kiln, the loom that required a consistent heat at its edges to prevent the wool from knotting. The Protagoras account makes Prometheus the philosophical patron of something larger than the myth's older versions quite specify. He becomes, in Plato's retelling, the patron of human self-improvement through craft, the figure who gave people not only the means to survive the cold, but the means to make things they had not imagined before. Every practical art that requires heat to begin is, in this tradition, downstream of what Prometheus carried out of the workshops of Hephaestus and Athena, the smith working iron, the potter shaping clay before the kiln, the metal worker lost in the particular concentration of someone bending hot bronze into a new form. All of them are working in a tradition that, according to Plato's Protagoras, began with a single act of theft. The potters of Athens worked in the Kerameikos. The name of the district is the origin of the English word ceramic, a place so thoroughly identified with the making of fired clay objects that the district and the craft became the same word across centuries and languages. The kilns there burned on the same fire that burned everywhere in Athens, the same fire that had been carried in the torch race from the altar at the academy, the same fire that Prometheus had carried in the hollow stalk of a dried fennel plant. This is not metaphor in the Athenian understanding. The fire was the same fire. Its continuity was what the torch race maintained, not a commemoration of something lost, but a literal carrying forward of something still present. Among the craftsmen who worked in and around the Kerameikos were the potters who painted on their vessels the images of the mythological tradition they lived inside. Prometheus was among the figures they painted. His story appeared on cups, on cratters used to mix wine and water at symposium tables, on the surfaces of objects that were handled daily and used for the ordinary business of eating and drinking in company. The myth was not housed in temples alone, or in the performances of tragedy at the festival of Dionysus, or in the written texts of poets and philosophers. It was on the vessel in front of the guest. It was in the room. Among the oldest surviving visual evidence of the Promethean tradition is a Laconian black figure cup from approximately 560 BCE, attributed to the Arcesilas painter and now held in the Vatican museums. Its date puts it before the great tragic tradition, before Aeschylus wrote Prometheus Bound, before the full dramatic elaboration of the myth's most famous scenes, and yet the cup already shows what the tradition knew: Prometheus at his rock, the eagle present, the essential image already fixed. The archaic style gives everything its characteristic economy, figures reduced to their necessary lines, the scene communicating what it must without additional explanation, because the person holding the cup already knew the story and needed only the image to confirm it. The cup is small. It would have fit in two hands, curved to the shape of the bowl, painted in the black figure technique, in which the figures are dark against the clay's natural color. Its existence confirms that the punishment of Prometheus was not an invention of the tragic playwrights, but a story already circulating in the visual culture of the mid-6th century, painted on a drinking vessel for use at a table, passed from hand to hand at a symposium where wine was poured, and the conversation turned on whatever it turned on: politics, philosophy, the upcoming games, the price of olive oil in the agora, while on the surface of the cup, Prometheus sat at his rock, and the eagle kept its appointment. The black figure technique was the dominant decorative mode of Athenian pottery through much of the 6th century. Its characteristic look, dark silhouettes incised with fine lines to show detail, the natural reddish-orange of Attic clay warming the background. The potters who used this technique were skilled artisans working with fire as their primary tool, shaping clay, incising lines, applying the slip that would darken in the kiln, controlling temperature through the phases of firing, with a precision that came from years of practice. They worked, in other words, exactly as Prometheus's gift had made possible. The fire in the kiln was the condition of the cup. The cup carried the image of the figure who had made the fire available. The myth was folded into the object that illustrated it. This quality of embeddedness, the myth not separate from the daily objects of the culture, but living inside them, is one of the things that makes the Promethean tradition unusual, even within a tradition that was generally present in Athenian material life. Hercules appeared on cups. Athena appeared on the coins of the city. The gods and heroes moved through Athenian daily existence on surfaces of clay and bronze and silver. Prometheus was among them, but his particular position, patron of the craftsmen who made those very surfaces, patron of the fire that fired those very objects, gave his myth a kind of recursive presence. The craftsman painting the cup was painting his own patron on the cup his craft had made possible. The festivals of Athens in which Prometheus was honored alongside Hephaestus were associated specifically with the craft-dependent trades, the benosio, the working craftsmen whose labor shaped the physical city. The word benosioi carried in some ancient sources a slight condescension from the perspective of those who performed gymnasium exercise or philosophical contemplation. But the festivals that honored the Titan patron of fire did not carry that condescension. The trades that depended on fire, smithing, pottery, metalwork, the shaping of bronze and iron and clay, were the trades that built and maintained the physical infrastructure of the city, its tools, its vessels, its coins, its weapons, its architectural ornaments. The Hephaestia, the festival shared by Prometheus and Hephaestus, honored both the divine smith and the Titan who had given craftsmen fire in the first place. The Hephaestia included its own torch race, distinct from the Promethean lampadodromia, though similarly structured around the carrying of fire across a route. Athens was in this sense a city where fire moved ceremonially through the streets more than once in the festival year, carried in runners' hands from one fixed point to another, the flame maintained across the distance between its sacred origin and its civic destination. The city's relationship to fire was not purely practical, it was also ceremonial, repeated, annually renewed. The fire had to travel. The fire had to arrive still burning. This was understood to matter. In Athenian civic life, the Prytanean, the city's public hearth, maintained a sacred flame that was held to represent the life of the community. When Athenian colonists left to found a new city in some other part of the Greek world, they carried fire from the Prytanean of Athens with them, lighting the hearth of the new community from the hearth of the old. The fire traveled with them. It arrived in the new place already connected to what it had left. The colony's hearth was the same hearth as Athens's hearth, extended across whatever distance the ships had sailed. The sacred fire of Greek civic life was not a flame that burned in one place, but a flame that traveled, carried from one hearth to the next, always already in motion across distances. This understanding, fire as something that moves rather than something that stays, that is carried rather than stored, that lives in its transmission from one point to another, is present in the language Hesiod uses to describe the theft. The fire that Prometheus took is fire that travels far. The description gives it the quality of a journey. It is not a thing removed from one location and deposited in another. It is a thing in motion, and its motion is part of what it is. The ember in the fennel stalk was already traveling when it left Olympus. The flame in the runner's hand at the Lampadoromia was already traveling when the race began. The fire carried from Athens to a new colony was already traveling when it crossed the sea. In the Greek understanding of what Prometheus had done, the fire had never stopped moving. The Academy Grove, where the altar stood, was by the 5th century a place layered with significance that had accumulated over generations. Pausanias describes it as a location already ancient in his time. The gymnasium had been the training ground of Athenian youth. The altar of Prometheus had been there long enough to be simply a known feature of the landscape. Plato's school had added a third layer, philosophy conducted in a place already associated with athletic training and religious observance, in the shade of olive trees beneath which generations of runners had already warmed up for the race. When Plato sat in the academy and thought about what Prometheus had given humanity, he was sitting in a grove that had been saying the same thing for centuries in stone. The philosophical interpretation that Plato gave to the Promethean myth in the Protagoras did not replace the older understanding, but sat beside it. The myth could be told as Hesiod told it, a theft, a punishment, a cycle of destruction and regeneration at the rock in the Caucasus. It could be told as Plato's Protagoras told it, a philosophical origin story for the practical arts, a myth that explains why humans survived, where other animals, better equipped by nature, had long since outpaced them. Both versions were available to any literate Athenian of the 5th or 4th century, and neither canceled the other. The tradition was not a single text. It was a conversation across centuries between versions of a story that had never fully settled. The torch race moved through all of this. It did not choose between Hesiod's Prometheus and Plato's. It was older than Plato and older than the dramatic tradition that had produced Prometheus Bound. It was a practice, not an interpretation, and its meaning was enacted rather than argued. The runner at the academy altar knew what the flame was, not as a proposition to be evaluated, but as a thing in hand, warm, requiring care to keep it going, requiring motion to stay alive. A standing flame that no one tended would gutter and fail. A carried flame, moving with the runner, fed by the runner's motion through the air, was a flame that could travel as far as the runner could run. The relay structure of the Lampadromia added another dimension to this. A single runner carrying the flame, the full distance would eventually tire, and the flame would travel only as far as one person's endurance allowed. The relay passed the flame from hand to hand, each runner receiving it from the one before and carrying it to the next, so that the flame's journey was distributed across many bodies, none of them alone responsible for the whole distance. This structure made the torch race a social act as much as an athletic one. The fire survived because it was passed on. What Prometheus had given was not something any one person could hold alone for the full length of the journey. It required transmission, the image of fire passing from one runner's hand to the next, that specific moment of transfer, one torch tipped to another, the flame crossing the gap between two people before the first runner releases it, is perhaps the most precise image the Lampedromia offers of what the tradition understood Prometheus to have done. He had not given fire to a single person who would then keep it privately. He had started a transmission. The ember moved from the stalk to human hands, and from human hands to hearths, and from hearths to the kilns of potters, and the forges of smiths, and the civic altars of cities, and the hearths of colonies founded on distant shores. Each transfer was the same transfer, repeated across distance and time, the flame crossing the gap between one point and the next, arriving still burning. The old olive trees of the Academy Grove are gone now. The altar of Prometheus does not stand. The Lampedromia is not run. The specific site of the gymnasium where runners trained for the race has been located by archaeology northwest of the modern city, and the area has been partially excavated, but what remains is buried and fragmentary, not the open grove with its worn paths and its starting altar that Plato walked through. The tradition that filled that grove, the annual assembly of runners, the lit torches, the departure toward the city, ended at some point in the long attenuation of classical Athenian civic life, its precise terminus lost in the centuries of gradual change that replaced one set of practices with another, and yet the Laconian black figure cup is in the Vatican museums. It is held there in a collection of ancient objects available to scholars and visitors, its painted figures still clear in the archaic style's economical lines, Prometheus at the rock, the eagle maintaining its ancient appointment, the cup that was made in a kiln fired by the same fire it depicts, that was used at a table where the myth was perhaps discussed by people who had also watched the Lampedromia, that passed at some point from use to preservation, is still present. It is older than most of the buildings that now stand in the places where Athens stood. It has outlasted the grove and the altar and the race it may once have decorated a table near. Plato's texts are also still present. The Republic still opens with its casual mention of the torch race. The narrator, who has gone to see the Lampedromia with Glaucon and been detained by the conversation that follows. The Protagoras still carries its account of Prometheus and Epimetheus and the gift of fire and technical wisdom to the unprepared humans. The texts are the record of a philosophical conversation that was held in the same grove where the race began, in the shade of trees beneath which the torch was lit every year. They are a different kind of transmission, not fire but words, not moving through the streets, but moving through centuries on papyrus and parchment and print, and they have traveled further than the race did, arriving in reading rooms and libraries and classrooms in places that did not exist when the fennel stalk was first cut. Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound is also still present, or most of it. The text survives with some gaps attributed to Aeschylus, though its authorship has been the subject of scholarly argument. Performed originally at the festival of Dionysus, in a city where the Lampedromia was already a familiar ceremony. The tragedy that dramatizes the chaining of Prometheus at the rock in the Caucasus, Hephaestus reluctant at his task, Kratos cold and legalistic at his. Prometheus chained and silent, and then speaking, was performed for audiences who worshipped at the altar in the Academy Grove and ran or watched the race through the streets. They brought both things with them into the theater, the story as Hesiod had told it, and the story as the race enacted it, and the story as Aeschylus was now staging it in the open air of the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis. The myth was never one thing. It was always multiple, told in multiple registers, enacted in multiple forms, painted on the curve of a cup, and staged in the immensity of the theater and run as a relay through the streets of the city. What persisted across all of these was the fire, not as metaphor and not as symbol, as fire, specific and warm, moving from one point to another, arriving at its destination still burning. The tradition held that this was what Prometheus had done, started the fire moving, given it to people who could carry it, and let it go. The Academy altar is gone. The runners have been still for many centuries. The olive trees of that particular grove no longer stand in the shape the ancient city knew them, but the Protagoras is still being read, and the Theogony is still being read, and the black figure cup is still in the Vatican, and the image it carries, the figure at the rock, the eagle, the essential gesture of the whole myth compressed into painted lines on a drinking vessel, is still visible to anyone who looks. The tradition that produced the Lampadaromia also produced Plato's school and Aeschylus's theater, and the thousands of vessels painted with mythological scenes in the workshops of the Kerameikos. It produced a way of thinking about fire, about what it is to carry something from a source toward a destination, to pass it from hand to hand across a distance, to keep it burning through the transfer. The runners at the Academy Grove assembled before the race each year and waited for the moment to begin. The flame at the altar was already burning. The route through the streets was already known, the same route it had been the year before, and the year before that, worn into the city's geography by repetition, the destination fixed, the relay points established.